So, when you think of top secret World War II operations, you probably think of names like Overlord or Market Garden, right? But what if I told you about one of the most terrifying plans ever dreamed up by the British military, codenamed Operation Vegetarian? It sounds harmless, almost peaceful even, but the reality behind that name is one of the darkest stories of the war.
And that brings us to this absolutely wild question. The secret weapon at the heart of this plan wasn't some new kind of bomb or a team of spies. Nope. It was millions of totally ordinary linseed cattle cakes. So how on earth was that supposed to bring the entire Third Reich to its knees?
Well, because the name was a sick joke, a total deception, this had nothing to do with promoting a plant-based diet. It was all about creating a biological nightmare on a scale that is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around.
Okay, here's the plan in all its horrifying glory.
Operation Vegetarian was a British biowarfare strategy to drop millions of linseed cakes laced with deadly anthrax spores all over Germany. The goal? A terrifying 1-2 punch. First, kill off the nation's cattle, and then, as people ate the contaminated meat and drank the milk, cause mass human death and kickstart a famine that would cripple the country.
So, how exactly would this lethal recipe work? Well, the terrifying part is just how brutally simple it was. It was basically a biological chain reaction designed to spread like wildfire.
Here's how it would go down. Step 1, British bombers fly over Germany and drop 5 million of these infected cakes onto grazing fields. Step 2, unsuspecting German cattle eat the cakes and contract anthrax. Step 3, the infection silently works its way into the human food supply through meat and milk. And the final step, widespread death and the complete collapse of the food system, hopefully destroying the German war effort from the inside out.
Now, to create a weapon this bizarre, the British government couldn't just go to a normal munitions factory. They had to build a very, very strange assembly line.
Get this, the full-size cakes came from a place called the Olympia Oil and Cake Company. Okay, that makes sense. But the job of slicing them into little weaponized 10-gram pieces, that went to a soap manufacturer, J&E Atkinson. I mean, think about that. A company that makes bath soap was now prepping a weapon of mass destruction.
And who do you think got the most dangerous job of all? The task of actually injecting the deadly anthrax into each and every one of those millions of little cakes? A team of just 13 women. Their old job? They used to be soap makers.
The man pulling the strings on this whole terrifying project was Paul Fields. He was the director of biology at the infamous Porton Research Facility, a place known for its work in chemical and biological weapons. He was the mastermind putting all these bizarre and deadly pieces together.
Of course, before you drop something like this on an enemy country, you have to be 100% sure it works. And to do that, they needed a secret, remote, and incredibly dangerous place to test it. They found the perfect spot. Grunard Island, a tiny, uninhabited little chunk of land just off the coast of Scotland. It was the ideal, isolated laboratory for a top-secret biological weapons test. So in 1941, they brought 60 sheep out to the island and dropped an anthrax bomb. The results were, well, they were horrifyingly successful. The official report said the test was, and I quote, more effective than expected. Every single sheep was dead within days. The weapon worked. In fact, it worked a little too well. The anthrax spores contaminated the island so completely that it became one of the most dangerous places on the planet. It was totally quarantined, a complete no-go zone for almost 50 years. Just think about that timeline for a second. The test happens in 1941. 2 years later, they have to officially quarantine the whole island. And it wasn't until 1990, decades after the war was over, that Grunard Island was finally declared safe for life again. That's how persistent this stuff was.
Okay, so the tests were a terrifying success. The cakes were rolling off the assembly line, and the delivery planes were ready. Operation Vegetarian was on the verge of going from a theoretical nightmare to a horrifying reality. By the spring of 1944, everything was a go. The plan was to hit Germany in the summer, when the cattle would be out grazing in the open fields. Modified bombers would conduct a lightning-fast 18-minute raid over a 60-mile stretch of farmland and just unleash the plague. So the weapon was ready. The planes were fueled up. The target was painted on the map. So why did it never happen? Why was one of the most devastating weapons of the entire war just left on the shelf? The simple answer is D-Day. The Normandy landings were so successful and the Allied troops started advancing across Europe so quickly that a drastic, catastrophic, and frankly unpredictable weapon like this just wasn't seen as necessary anymore. Conventional warfare was getting the job done. But you gotta remember, by the time they scrapped the mission, production was already finished. And this is the number of anthrax-infected cattle cakes that were just sitting in storage, ready to go. 5 million tiny pellets of death. And what happened to this stockpile? Well, shortly after the war finally ended, all 5 million of those cakes were loaded into a giant incinerator and burned to ash, bringing the strange and terrible story of Operation Vegetarian to a quiet end.
It's really worth pausing for a moment to think about what was averted. This wasn't just another bomb. If it had been used, it could have unleashed a plague that would have wiped out Germany's entire food supply, causing unimaginable suffering for millions of civilians, long after the war was actually over.
And all of this leaves us with one last, lingering question. We only know about Operation Vegetarian because the files were declassified decades later. It really makes you wonder, what other horrifying plans were cooked up in the secret labs of World War II? And, even more chilling, what might be sitting on a shelf somewhere right now?